Louisiana, where the air hung thick and heavy with the scent of jasmine and the distant, thickeningly sweet smell of processed sugarcane, lay Oak Creek Plantation. To a traveler on the main road, it was an oil painting come to life. A magnificent white manor, its grand columns like bleached bones, stood proudly at the end of a long avenue of ancient weeping oak trees. The grounds were meticulously kept, a testament to the wealth and power of its master, Elias Caldwell. This was the illusion of grace, a beautiful lie crafted from the brutal, unending labor of 200 enslaved souls. The true heart of Oak Creek, the engine that fueled its opulence, was not the grand ballroom or the master's study. It was the kitchen. A large brick-floored building separate from the big house, it was a world of perpetual heat, smoke, and relentless work. And at the center of this world was Elara. To call Elara a cook was to call a master painter a house painter. She was an artist, and the kitchen was her studio. Her hands, though calloused from a lifetime of labor, moved with a dancer's grace. She knew the precise moment a roux turned from golden to a rich, nutty brown. She could listen to the sizzle of fat in a pan and know if the heat was too high. But her true genius lay in a deeper, more ancient knowledge, a legacy passed down through whispers in the dark from her grandmother. Her grandmother had been a healer in her homeland, a woman who understood the secret language of the earth. She had taught Elara not just how to blend spices, but how to read the leaves of a plant, how to understand the properties of a root. She taught Elara which herbs could soothe a colicky baby, which poultice could draw the infection from a wound, and which rare, beautiful flowers held a power so profound it was a conversation with life and death itself. For Elara, this knowledge was a sacred trust, used only to mend and to soothe. When old Thomas's cough grew ragged, it was Elara's willow bark tea that brought him comfort. When a child fell and scraped their knee, it was Elara's salve that prevented a scar. She was a silent healer in a world designed to break them. But her most precious creations were not for the master's table. They were for her two children, Lio and Zena. They were her world, her reason for enduring the endless dawns and punishing dusks. Lio, at 8 years old, had a mind that raced with questions, his dark eyes absorbing every detail of the world around him. Zena, at 6, was pure sunshine, her laughter a melody that could for a moment make the grim realities of the slave quarters disappear. Their small, one-room cabin was not a prison, it was a sanctuary. In the evenings, after the final pots were scrubbed and the kitchen fires were banked, Elara would transform. The weary, subservient cook would vanish, replaced by a mother whose love was a fierce, protective shield. She would gather her children close, the smell of wood smoke and spices still clinging to her clothes, and tell them the stories. Not stories of their current life, but the secret stories of their people. Tales of clever Anansi the spider, of powerful kings and queens in a land of golden sun, and of ancestors whose spirits, she would whisper, still watched over them from the stars. One evening, as a storm rumbled in the distance, she gave Lio a small, rough-hewn bird she had carved from a piece of driftwood. "The body can be in a cage," she told him, her voice low and intense, as she wrapped his small fingers around the wood. "But the spirit, Lio, must always know how to fly. This is your spirit. Never let them break it." Lio looked from the bird to his mother's face, his expression one of solemn understanding far beyond his years. He clutched it as if it were a living thing. This small world of love and secret defiance existed in the shadow of Master Elias Caldwell. Caldwell was a man of calculated cruelties. He was not a frothing madman. His evil was colder, more insidious. He saw his slaves not as people, but as investments. He would speak of them in the same tone he used for livestock or lumber, weighing their value, their productivity, their depreciation. He would praise Elara's cooking in front of his guests, calling her a treasure. But the words were hollow, for one cannot treasure a tool in the same way one treasures a life. He would watch her children playing from his veranda, not with affection, but with the cold calculation of an investor watching his assets mature. To him, they were future hands for the field or future profits on the auction block. This cold reality was a constant, unspoken terror that hung over Elara's world, and it was a terror that was about to become horrifyingly real. It began like any other, with a suffocating pre-dawn humidity that promised a brutal day of heat. Elara was already in the kitchen, her hands deftly kneading a mountain of dough for the morning's bread. A strange stillness hung over the plantation, a quiet that felt heavy and unnatural. Around mid-morning, she saw them, two men on horseback, their fine city clothes looking out of place against the raw, rustic backdrop of Oak Creek. They were not neighbors. They were strangers, with the hard, emotionless eyes of men who dealt in commodities, not in people. They dismounted and went directly into the big house, disappearing for what felt like an eternity. Elara tried to push the unease from her mind, focusing on the rhythm of her work, but a cold knot of dread was tightening in her stomach. Every distant laugh from the big house, every footstep on the veranda sent a jolt of anxiety through her. An hour later, a house servant appeared at the kitchen door. "Master Caldwell wants you," the young woman said, her eyes refusing to meet Elara's. "On the front veranda, now." Wiping her floured hands on her apron, Elara walked from the sweltering heat of the kitchen into the blinding sunlight. As she approached the grand steps of the manor, her world tilted on its axis. There, standing in the shadow of the great white columns, were her children. Leo stood stiffly, his small face a mask of confusion and fear. Zena was crying, her small body trembling. A thick, coarse rope was looped around their tiny wrists, tethering them to one of the strangers. Master Caldwell stood nearby, swirling a glass of brandy, an expression of mild impatience on his face. The air left Elara's lungs. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The scene was so monstrously wrong, her mind refused to process it. "Master!" The word was a dry whisper, a flake of ash in her throat. "What is the meaning of this? Why are my children tied?" Caldwell took a slow sip of his brandy before answering. He didn't look at her, but at the traders, as if completing a business transaction. "Elara," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion, "I've had some unfortunate financial setbacks this season. These gentlemen, traders from New Orleans, have helped me resolve the matter. They've made a very generous offer." He gestured vaguely with his glass towards Leo and Zena. "They're to be taken to a new estate downriver." The world went silent. All Elara could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart. "No," she breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, master, you cannot. They are my children. They are just children." "And they are my property," Caldwell stated, his voice hardening with irritation. "Elara, I am most valuable asset in that kitchen. I would never sell you. But them? They are young, strong stock, a sound investment for their new owner." The cold, clinical words shattered the last remnants of Elara's composure. A primal scream, a sound of pure, animalistic agony tore from her throat.
It was the sound of a mother watching her world being ripped apart. She lunged forward. Her only instinct was to get to her children, to shield them, to hold them. But the second traitor was quicker. He stepped in front of her and shoved her hard. She stumbled backward, tripping on the hem of her dress and crashing heavily onto the dusty ground. From her place in the dirt, she watched the nightmare unfold in horrifying slow motion. Zina was wailing, reaching for her with a small, bound hand. Leo was not crying. His face was pale, his eyes wide and fixed on his mother's, filled with a terrifying, silent understanding. He was trying to be brave for her. The men began to pull them toward a waiting carriage. "Mama!" Zina's shriek was a physical blow. "Mama, don't let them take us!" Elara scrambled to her feet, ready to fight, to claw, to bite, to do anything. But the first traitor drew a long, cruel-looking pistol from his belt. He didn't point it at her, but simply held it, a clear and unspoken threat. She froze, a terrible, paralyzing helplessness washing over her. She was powerless. Her eyes locked with Leo's one final time. He was still holding the small wooden bird she had carved for him. As the traitor yanked him harshly toward the carriage, his small fingers, slick with sweat and tears, lost their grip. The bird fell, landing silently in the dust at the foot of the veranda steps, forgotten. The carriage door slammed shut, the driver cracked his whip. As the carriage rolled away, leaving a thick cloud of choking dust in its wake, Elara stood like a statue carved from grief. The cries of her children faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt like the end of the world. And in that silence, the woman known as Elara died. Her body remained, but her soul had been scooped out, leaving a hollow, aching void. A void that would soon be filled with something dark, patient, and utterly unforgiving.
That followed, Elara became a ghost. She moved through the plantation, a specter haunting the edges of life, her presence felt but never truly seen. She performed her duties in the kitchen with a chilling, robotic efficiency. The bread still rose, the stews still simmered, the roasts were still cooked to perfection, but the love, the soul that had once infused her cooking was gone. The food was technically perfect, but it was lifeless. It was sustenance without joy, a reflection of the woman who now prepared it. The other slaves watched her with a mixture of pity and fear. They had seen grief before, had felt its sting in their own lives countless times. But this was different. Elara's grief was not a loud, wailing thing. It was a dense, silent gravity that seemed to bend the very air around her. She no longer spoke unless a direct question was asked of her, and her replies were clipped, empty monosyllables. She no longer met anyone's gaze. Her eyes, once warm and expressive, were now flat and vacant, like windows to an abandoned house. The nights were the crucible where her transformation was forged. Sleep offered no escape, only a landscape of relentless nightmares. She would see her children's faces, hear their desperate cries, feel the phantom weight of Zina in her arms, the small hand of Lio in hers. She would wake up gasping in the suffocating darkness of her empty cabin, the silence a roaring torment in her ears. For the first week she wept until her body was a dry, aching husk. But then the tears stopped. The grief did not lessen. Instead, it began to change, to transmute. It was like water freezing into ice, the same substance, but now hard, sharp, and capable of breaking things. Her sorrow slowly crystallized into a single, diamond-hard emotion: hatred. It was a pure, cold, and patient hatred directed not just at the traitors who had taken her children, but at the man who had signed their fate. With the flick of his pen,
Master Elias Caldwell. Her focus shifted. She stopped reliving the past and began to study the present with a terrifying, predatory intensity. She became a student of her enemy. From the shadows of the kitchen doorway, she watched him. She memorized the cadence of his walk, the arrogant tilt of his head, the way he laughed, a booming, self-satisfied sound that made the rage in her chest burn like a banked fire. She listened to the gossip of the house servants, piecing together the details of his life, his habits, his vanities. She learned that his greatest vanity, the event that defined his sense of self-worth, was the annual Harvest Gala. It was more than just a party. It was a ritual of power. It was where he flaunted his wealth, where he solidified his status among the other planters, where he sat at the head of a grand table and played the benevolent king of his own cruel kingdom. The gala was the monument he built to himself each year, and it was on the altar of this pride that Elara decided she would make her sacrifice. The idea did not come to her in a flash of lightning. It grew slowly, organically in the dark, fertile soil of her hatred. She would not use a knife or a gun. That was too quick, too merciful. Her revenge had to be as cruel and intricate as the system that had stolen her life. She would use her gift, the very skill he praised, the very reason he had kept her while selling her children, would become the instrument of his undoing. She would poison them all. But death was not enough. Death was an ending. She wanted a reckoning. She wanted him to suffer, to be aware, to understand the totality of his ruin. And as she searched the deep, hidden archives of her grandmother's knowledge, she remembered the whispers. The stories of the old lands, of plants that held power beyond simple healing or killing. She remembered the story of a specific vine, a beautiful deceiver. Her grandmother had spoken of it only once, her voice low and filled with a fearful reverence. A vine with flowers the color of a deep twilight, whose roots held not the peace of death, but the torment of a living hell. A poison that did not kill the body, but instead built a prison around the mind. The plan began to take shape, a meticulous and terrible architecture of vengeance. She would not just destroy Elias Caldwell, she would dismantle his world, piece by piece, right before his very eyes, and she would do it from the one place he believed her to be powerless, his kitchen. The ghost of Oak Creek had found her purpose.
Now a cold, solid core within her, Elara's every action became deliberate. The gala was 6 weeks away. Time was both her enemy and her ally. She needed to prepare, and her preparations had to be invisible, conducted in the fleeting moments stolen from a life of constant observation. Her first task was to find the instrument of her revenge. She had to venture into the cypress swamp, a place that held a primal fear for most. It was a labyrinth of black water, gnarled cypress knees, and grasping Spanish moss that hung from the trees like the tattered robes of ghosts. It was a place where a person could disappear without a trace. But Elara was no longer afraid of earthly things. The greatest horrors were the ones she carried inside. For her, the swamp was not a place of death, but a place of ancient power. It was her grandmother's world, a church of earth and shadow. She chose a moonless, starless night, the kind of oppressive darkness that felt like a thick velvet blanket. Slipping out of her cabin, she moved with a silence born of a lifetime of walking where she was not wanted. She navigated the treacherous terrain not by sight, but by memory and instinct, her bare feet finding purchase on the damp, root-laced ground. The air was thick with the smell of decay and life, the night alive with the chorus of insects and the deep bellow of bullfrogs. Deeper and deeper she went, into the heart of the swamp until the last vestiges of the plantation were a distant memory. She was searching for a specific type of environment, a convergence of shadow and water that her grandmother had described. And then she saw it. Climbing the trunk of an ancient, gnarled cypress tree, its form almost invisible in the profound darkness, was the vine. Even in the gloom, she could make out the shape of its leaves and the dark clusters of its flowers, their deep purple hue like a bruise against the night. The veiled creeper. She knelt at the base of the tree, her hands hovering over the dark, rich soil. This was not a simple act of gathering. It was a covenant. She was calling upon a power that demanded respect. Whispering a silent prayer to the spirits of her ancestors and to the spirit of the plant itself, she began to dig. She used her bare hands, her fingers pushing through the damp earth, feeling for the thick, gnarled roots. When she found them, she harvested them with a methodical care, taking only what she needed, leaving the rest of the plant to live. She wrapped the roots in a piece of damp cloth and began the long, silent journey back, the instruments of her terrible justice held close to her chest. The transformation of the roots was a secret, nocturnal ritual. In the dead of night, in the privacy of her cabin, she would work by the light of a single flickering tallow candle. The cabin door would be barred, a ragged cloth stuffed into the cracks to ensure no light escaped. First, she meticulously cleaned every speck of dirt from the roots. Then she began the painstaking process of slicing them into thin, almost translucent slivers with a sharpened shard of flint. She laid them out on a flat stone near the dying embers of her small hearth, allowing them to dry slowly over several days until they were brittle and feather-light. The final step was the most crucial. Using a smooth, heavy river stone as a pestle and a hollowed-out piece of wood as a mortar, she began to grind. The sound was a soft, rhythmic whisper in the silence. Shh, shh, like the patient hiss of a serpent. It was the sound of her grief, her rage, and her love being crushed, concentrated, and refined into a potent physical form. Night after night she ground the roots until they were reduced to a fine, dark powder, almost indistinguishable from common black pepper. It had no scent, no distinctive taste. It was the perfect weapon, silent, invisible, and absolute. She poured the finished powder into a small, tightly woven cloth pouch, which then she hid deep in the straw ticking of her mattress, a secret sleeping beside her every night. As the day of the gala drew closer, a strange, almost serene calm settled over her. The ghost who had haunted the plantation began to recede, replaced by a woman of unnerving focus. There was a new light in her eyes, not of warmth, but of a terrifying, incandescent clarity. She had made her peace with what she was about to do. This was not murder. Murder was an act of passion. This was a ceremony. It was a rebalancing of the scales. She was no longer just Elara, the cook. She was an instrument of a justice so profound it had to be drawn from the earth itself. She was ready. harvest gala dawned hot and brilliant, a perfect sky mocking the darkness of the day's true purpose. Oak Creek was a flurry of orchestrated chaos. In the fields, the work was relentless as the last of the harvest was brought in. In the big house, servants polished silver until it gleamed and hung festive garlands, their movements hurried and anxious under the sharp eye of the mistress. But in the kitchen, there was an island of unnerving calm, and its name was Elara. She moved through the sweltering heat and controlled bedlam of her domain with the grace and focus of a high priestess preparing a sacred rite. Her voice was steady as she issued commands, her hands precise as she measured, chopped, and stirred. She was preparing a feast for the ages, a monument to the gluttony and arrogance of the people she was about to destroy. The scent of roasting meats, baking bread, and simmering spices filled the air, a rich and decadent perfume that belied its deadly secret. The centerpiece of the meal was to be Master Caldwell's favorite, a slow-roasted wild boar, served with a rich, dark gravy made from the pan drippings, red wine, and a host of secret spices. As the hour of the feast approached, the kitchen reached its peak of frenzied activity. It was in this moment, when all eyes were on their individual tasks, that Elara acted. Turning her back to the others, she stood before the large, bubbling pot of gravy. For a single breathless moment she paused. In her mind's eye, she saw Leo's face, brave and terrified. She saw Zena's tears. She felt the phantom weight of the wooden bird in her palm. This was not for hatred alone. It was for them. It was the only thing left she could give them. It was justice. Her hand, steady as a surgeon's, reached into the pocket of her apron and retrieved the small cloth pouch. With a slow, deliberate tilt, she emptied the dark, finely ground powder into the simmering liquid. She stirred the gravy once, twice, with a heavy wooden ladle. The powder dissolved instantly, vanishing without a trace, becoming one with the rich, dark sauce. Her face remained a mask of calm, betraying none of the cataclysm she had just unleashed. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson, the guests began to arrive. Carriages rolled up the oak-lined avenue, depositing the wealthy planters of the parish, their wives adorned in jewels that glittered in the lantern light. The sound of their laughter and shallow pleasantries drifted into the kitchen, a sound that grated on Elara's soul. From the shadows of the service doorway, she watched. She saw Master Caldwell beaming at the head of a long, laden table, playing the part of the magnanimous host. He raised his crystal glass, the candlelight catching in the expensive wine. "To a bountiful harvest," he declared, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a king, "and to the continued prosperity of Oak Creek." A chorus of "Hear, hear!" echoed through the hall. The feast began. Elara watched as platter after platter was carried from her kitchen and presented to the ravenous guests. She watched as they gorged themselves, their manners slipping as they indulged in the fruits of her labor and her rage. Her eyes never left Master Caldwell. She watched him take a generous portion of the roasted boar and then, with a satisfied sigh, ladle a large spoonful of the dark, rich gravy over the meat. He took a bite, closed his eyes in a moment of pure bliss, and nodded to his wife in approval. It was the best he had ever tasted. The poison did not act immediately. It was patient, just as she had been.
The first sign was almost imperceptible. A guest, a portly man in the middle of a boisterous story, suddenly stopped with a look of mild confusion as he put his hand to his throat. Another guest's fork clattered onto his plate as his hand spasmed. A woman's laugh died in her throat, turning into a strangled gasp. A ripple of unease spread across the table. Then the wave hit. A man slumped forward, his face hitting his plate with a sickening thud. A woman's body went rigid, her back arching in a silent, agonizing seizure before freezing in place. Panic erupted. But there were no screams from the afflicted. Their bodies had become their prisons, their muscles locked, their mouths frozen shut, their lungs struggling for air, but their eyes were wide open, lucid, and filled with a pure, unadulterated terror as they became living statues at a banquet of the damned. The final spectacle was Elias Caldwell. He saw what was happening, his arrogant face contorting into a mask of disbelief and horror. He pushed his chair back, attempting to stand, but his legs refused his command. He staggered, his arms flailing, and then crashed heavily to the floor, his wineglass shattering beside him. He lay there, amidst the ruin of his feast, utterly paralyzed but fully conscious. His terrified eyes darted around the room, taking in the horrific tableau. His wife froze in mid-gasp, his friends trapped in grotesque poses of agony. His perfect world, his monument of pride, had become his tomb. His eyes finally found the kitchen doorway, and in the shadows, he saw her. He saw Elara, her face calm, her eyes holding his gaze with a cold, unwavering finality. In that moment, he understood. Amidst the chaos of the few servants who were now screaming and running, no one noticed the cook slip out the back door. Elara did not run. She walked with the steady, unhurried pace of someone whose work is finally done. In a small cloth sack, she carried a piece of bread, a flask of water, and the small wooden bird she had picked from the dust. She did not look back at the grand house, a place now filled with the silent, living dead. Her face was turned toward the deep, embracing darkness of the cypress swamp, toward an unknown future. She was walking toward her freedom. Elara was never seen or heard from again. The legend of the Harvest Gala, however, became a terrified whisper that haunted the parish for generations. Master Caldwell lived for several more years, a prisoner in his own body, cared for by resentful relatives, his mind sharp enough to comprehend the totality of his ruin every single day until his last silent breath. And in the slave quarters throughout Louisiana, a different story was told. A story of a cook who refused to be broken, of a mother's love that became a terrible sword of justice. They said that on the darkest nights, if you were a runaway slave seeking refuge in the cypress swamp, you might just feel a guiding presence, a spirit of vengeance and protection. They called her the Veiled Hand, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single determined soul can make an entire world of cruelty choke on its own sins.